Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today we're traveling back in time, thousands of years, to ancient India.
To explore the Vedas.
The Vedas. Okay, so...
These are foundational texts.
Right.
Really important for Hinduism, but really they shaped Indian culture in a way that we can still see the impact today.
Exactly. And we're talking about hymns and prayers and philosophical insights that kind of laid the groundwork for so much.
Yeah, it's really incredible because these texts were composed during a period of immense change in ancient India. And so they really offer us a window into how a civilization grapples with a new reality.
Okay, so what kind of changes are we talking about here? What was going on back then that would be reflected in these Vedas?
Well, imagine a society transitioning from a nomadic lifestyle to settled agriculture.
That's huge.
It's massive. And it wasn't just about new farming techniques. It was a whole new way of life.
Right.
A whole new way of thinking about your place in the world, your relationship to the land. And some scholars believe that anxieties and aspirations tied to this shift really echo throughout the Vedas.
That makes total sense. So we're not just talking about some dusty old scriptures. We're talking about a living record of how an entire civilization adapted to a completely new way of being.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, we're not talking about a single book here.
Right.
There are 4 Vedas, the Rigveda, the Samaveda, the Yajurveda, and the Atharvaveda. And each of them has its own unique focus, its own unique flavor, adding to this really complex tapestry of ancient Indian thought.
Okay, so let's untangle those threads a little bit. Tell me more about these different Vedas. What makes each one unique?
Well, the Rigveda is the oldest
and
arguably the most well-known. It's a collection of hymns to various deities, and it gives us a glimpse into how ancient Indians viewed the cosmos and their place within it.
I love that.
Yeah.
Then there's the Samaveda.
The Samaveda is all about melody and chant.
Oh, wow.
It suggests a deep connection between spirituality and music.
Oh, beautiful.
Almost like a soundtrack to their religious practices.
Yeah, I love that. What about the other two?
Well, the Yajurveda acts as a guide for priests conducting sacrifices, and it shows us just how intertwined religion was with everyday life. And lastly, there's the Atharvaveda, which delves into more mystical and philosophical territory, exploring everything from spells and incantations to the very nature of reality.
To spells and incantations.
Yeah.
I'm very intrigued. We were talking about poetic language earlier, and I know the Vedas are known for that.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. The Vedas are saturated with metaphors and symbolism,
Right.
which makes them incredibly beautiful, but also challenging to interpret.
Right.
It's not like reading a history textbook. You have to engage with the poetry, let it wash over you, and tease out the deeper meanings.
So it's more like deciphering a code than simply reading a text.
In a way, yes.
Can you give us an example, like a short quote to kind of illustrate what we're talking about here?
Sure. Take this passage from the Rigveda, a hymn dedicated to Ushas, the goddess of dawn. She shines upon us like a young wife, rousing every living being to go forth to his work. The fire had to be kindled by men. She made the light by which we see our way.
Beautiful. What kind of deeper meaning is hidden in those words?
On the surface, it's a beautiful description of dawn.
Yeah.
But there's a deeper layer about the power of the divine feminine, represented by Ushas, to awaken not just the world, but also human consciousness.
Wow. That's a pretty powerful image. It's like peeling back layers of meaning with these texts. So we've got these 4 different Vedas, all this incredible poetic language, and we're talking about the divine feminine. What else can you tell us about the core philosophical ideas woven through these texts?
Well, you can't talk about the Vedas without touching upon concepts like Brahman, Atman, Dharma, and karma. These are cornerstones of Indian thought that continue to resonate today.
Huge ideas.
Yeah.
Okay, let's break those down for our listeners a little bit.
Yeah.
What do these concepts actually mean, and how do they fit together in the Vedic worldview?
Okay, so think of Brahman as the ultimate reality. The cosmic principle that underpins everything. It's like the canvas on which the entire universe is painted. Atman, on the other hand, is the individual self, the soul.
So Brahman is that grand, all-encompassing reality, and Atman is our own personal piece of that reality.
You got it. And what's fascinating is that the Vedas suggest that Atman is ultimately identical to Brahman. Each individual soul is, in essence, a spark of the divine whole.
That's a pretty profound idea, and it actually reminds me of a lot of other spiritual traditions that emphasize that interconnectedness.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what about Dharma and karma? I feel like those are a little bit more about how we live our lives.
You're absolutely right. Dharma can be understood as duty righteousness or living in alignment with the cosmic order. It's about doing what's right, not just for yourself, but for the well-being of the whole.
I like that. And karma.
Karma is all about action and its consequences.
Okay, so it's not just about good or bad actions. It's about understanding that every choice we make sends ripples throughout the universe.
Exactly. And what's intriguing is that the Vedic understanding of karma is much more nuanced than the way it's often portrayed today. It's not a simple system of rewards and punishments.
Right.
It's more about a complex web of cause and effect playing out over lifetimes.
So every action has a ripple effect, not just in this life, but potentially in future lives as well. That's a pretty weighty concept.
It is, and it leads us to another interesting aspect of the Vedas, their role in shaping social structures in ancient India.
Okay.
And it's here that we need to address the origins of the caste system.
Okay. This is definitely a topic that needs careful consideration.
Yeah.
So what can you tell us about how the caste system emerged from this Vedic worldview?
It's important to remember that the caste system as we know it today, with its rigid hierarchy and social divisions, evolved over time. The Vedic conception of social order was much more fluid, with hymns suggesting a division of labor rather than a rigid social hierarchy.
Okay, so the seeds of the caste system were sown in the Vedas, but it wasn't the rigid and discriminatory system that we see later in Indian history.
Precisely. And while we can't ignore the role of the Vedas in the development of the caste system, it's crucial to understand them in their historical context.
You're right. We can't impose modern values onto these ancient texts. It's
Yeah.
about trying to understand the evolution of thought and social structures over time.
Mm.
So we've talked about these complex philosophical ideas, their influence on social structures. But what about the lasting legacy of the Vedas? Are they just historical artifacts, or do they still hold relevance in modern India?
That's a great question, and the answer is they're far from just historical relics. The Vedas continue to be a living source of inspiration and wisdom in India today.
Amazing.
Their influence can be felt in everything from religious ceremonies
Wow.
to yoga practices, even classical Indian music.
So the echoes of these ancient hymns are still resonating throughout Indian culture today.
Absolutely. The Vedas offer a rich tapestry of spiritual, philosophical, and social insights that continue to shape Indian thought and culture. They're not just about ancient history, they're about understanding the very fabric of a civilization that's constantly evolving, yet deeply rooted in its past.
That's incredible to think about texts that were composed thousands of years ago, still holding such profound meaning for people today.
It is remarkable.
It really speaks to the enduring power of these ideas. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this segment of our deep dive.
Don't worry, we'll be back soon to delve even deeper into this fascinating world of the Vedas.
Until then. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Vedas. We've been talking about these incredibly complex ideas, Brahman, Atman, Dharma, karma, and how they shaped ancient Indian society. But I'm kind of curious about the everyday people.
Yeah.
How did these grand philosophical concepts actually play out in their lives?
That's a great question. It's easy to get lost in the abstract ideas, but the Vedas weren't just philosophical treatises, they were woven into the fabric of everyday life.
So how did people actually live out these concepts? Give me some examples.
Well, take the concept of Dharma, for example. It wasn't just a lofty ideal, it was a practical guide for living. The Vedas actually lay out specific duties and responsibilities for individuals based on their social position and stage of life.
So Dharma wasn't just about being a good person in a general sense. It had specific guidelines and expectations.
Exactly. For instance, a young student's Dharma was to focus on learning and seeking knowledge, while a high holder's Dharma involved caring for their family and contributing to society.
It sounds like a very structured way of life, with everyone having a specific role to play. What about karma? How did that concept influence people's choices and actions?
The idea of karma encouraged people to act in accordance with Dharma, knowing that their actions had consequences not just in this life but also in future lives. This fostered a sense of accountability and responsibility.
So it wasn't about a divine being judging your actions. It was more about understanding the natural consequences of your choices.
Precisely. The Vedas emphasize that we are all weaving the tapestry of our own destiny through our actions. And this understanding infused everyday life with a sense of purpose and meaning.
It's fascinating how these concepts, which might seem abstract to us today, were so deeply integrated into ancient Indian society. But let's shift gears a bit. I'm curious about how the Vedas, these ancient texts from India, ended up influencing European thought, particularly during the British colonial period.
That's a crucial part of this story. In the 18th century, as the British East India Company was expanding its influence in India, European intellectuals were becoming increasingly fascinated with Eastern cultures and philosophies.
So it was like a collision of two worlds, each with its own set of beliefs and values.
Exactly. And this encounter with the Vedas, these texts that offered a glimpse into a completely different way of thinking, had a profound impact on European thought.
I can imagine. Here you have these ancient texts full of profound wisdom and poetic language, challenging the very assumptions of European culture.
Precisely. And it wasn't just a purely academic interest. This fascination with the Vedas was intertwined with the British East India Company's growing political and economic power in India.
So how did the British actually use their knowledge of the Vedas, or at least their interpretation of them, to shape their colonial policies?
Well, one way they did this was by invoking the concept of an ancient constitution. They argued that the Vedas provided evidence of a long-standing legal and social order in India, which they, as enlightened rulers, were obligated to uphold.
Hold on. That sounds a bit like they were using the Vedas to justify their own rule, doesn't it?
You're absolutely right to point that out. It was a complex and often contradictory situation. On the one hand, there was genuine intellectual curiosity and a fascination with Indian culture. But on the other hand, this interest was often used to legitimize their colonial ambitions.
It sounds like they were trying to have it both ways, admiring Indian culture while simultaneously using it to solidify their own power.
Exactly, and this selective appropriation of Indian knowledge wasn't limited to the Vedas. They also drew upon other texts like the Arthashastra, an ancient treatise on statecraft, to justify their administrative policies.
So they were cherry-picking aspects of Indian culture that suited their agenda while ignoring or even suppressing those that didn't.
That's a good way to put it. They were constructing a narrative that fit their own interests, even if it meant distorting or simplifying complex aspects of Indian history and culture.
It sounds like a very delicate balancing act, trying to appease both British and Indian interests while simultaneously asserting their dominance.
It was a delicate balancing act indeed, and one that would become increasingly difficult to maintain as the British East India Company's power grew. As their ambitions expanded, they became less interested in understanding India on its own terms and more focused on exploiting its resources and consolidating their control.
So the more powerful they became, the less they felt the need to justify their actions through Indian texts and traditions.
You could say that the initial fascination with Indian culture gave way to a more pragmatic and often exploitative approach to governance.
It's a bit disheartening to see how this initial curiosity about Indian culture and philosophy was ultimately overshadowed by colonial ambitions. But before we delve further into that, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, this concept of an ancient constitution. Can you elaborate on that? What exactly did the British mean by that, and how did they use it to shape their policies?
Of course. The idea of an ancient constitution was a way for the British to frame their rule in India as a continuation of a long-standing tradition rather than an imposition of foreign authority. They argued that the Vedas and other ancient texts provided evidence of a well-established system of governance in India, a system that had fallen into disarray.
So they were basically saying, we're not here to overturn your traditions. We're here to restore them.
Exactly. They presented themselves as the saviors of India, rescuing it from chaos and restoring its former glory. Of course, this narrative conveniently ignored the role of the British East India Company in destabilizing the region in the first place.
It sounds like a classic case of rewriting history to fit your own narrative. But how did this idea of an ancient constitution actually play out in practice? How did it shape British policies on the ground?
Well, one example is their approach to land ownership. The British, influenced by their own legal traditions, tended to view land as private property, something that could be bought, sold, and inherited. However, in many parts of India, land tenure was much more complex, involving a web of customary rights and obligations that didn't fit neatly into the British concept of private property.
So their attempt to impose a system of private land ownership, based on their understanding of this ancient constitution, actually clashed with the realities of Indian society.
Precisely. And this mismatch between theory and practice led to a lot of disruption and resentment. It's a prime example of how the British imposition of their own ideas about India, often based on a superficial understanding of ancient texts, had unintended and often negative consequences.
It sounds like they were trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, imposing a rigid system onto a much more fluid and complex reality.
Oh.
But let's delve deeper into the specifics of how this played out. What other examples can you give of how this concept of the ancient constitution shaped British policies and their interactions with Indian society?
Well, another key area where this concept came into play was in their approach to the legal system. The British were faced with the challenge of administering justice in a society with diverse legal traditions.
So they couldn't simply impose British law wholesale. They had to find a way to engage with existing legal frameworks.
Exactly. And this is where their understanding of the ancient constitution, particularly their interpretation of Dharma, played a role. They believed that the Vedas and other ancient texts provided a blueprint for a just and righteous legal system.
So how did they actually go about incorporating these ideas into their legal system? Did they simply adopt existing Indian laws?
It wasn't quite that straightforward. They created a hybrid system blending elements of British law with their interpretation of Hindu and Islamic legal traditions.
Sounds like a recipe for confusion and potential conflict. How did that actually work in practice?
Well, in some cases, they did try to incorporate elements of existing Indian law, particularly in matters of personal law, like marriage and inheritance. They even consulted with Indian legal experts known as Pandits and Malvis to gain insights into these traditions.
So there was some effort to understand and incorporate existing legal frameworks.
Yes, but it's important to remember that this incorporation was always on their terms. They ultimately held the power to decide which aspects of Indian law to uphold and which to discard.
It sounds like they were trying to create a system that appeared to respect Indian traditions while ultimately maintaining their own control.
You've hit the nail on the head. It was a delicate balancing act, and one that would become increasingly strained as the British East India Company's power and ambitions grew.
This raises a lot of interesting questions about how the British used their understanding, or perhaps misunderstanding, of Indian culture and history to justify their actions. But we'll have to delve deeper into that in our next segment.
Indeed, there's much more to explore. We've only just begun to unravel the complex ways in which the Vedas and their interpretations shaped British colonial policy in India.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been talking about the British and their fascination with the Vedas and how they use this ancient knowledge to shape their narrative of India.
Yeah.
Especially this ancient constitution concept.
Right. And as their power in India grew, that narrative started to shift. The focus moved away from simply upholding the ancient constitution to actively shaping India.
Oh, interesting.
In line with their own vision of progress and civilization.
So the more entrenched they became, the less they relied on Indian texts to legitimize their actions. They started imposing their own ideas more directly.
Exactly. While they initially saw themselves as restorers of India's past glory,
Right.
They increasingly took on the role of reformers aiming to modernize India according to British ideals.
That's a big shift. It sounds like a subtle but significant change in their approach to colonial rule.
It was.
What were some of the key areas where this new mindset manifested?
One really prominent example is the introduction of Western education in India.
Okay.
The British believed that by educating Indians in English and introducing them to European literature, philosophy, and science, they could uplift and civilize Indian society.
But wait, wasn't there already a rich tradition of education and scholarship in India?
Absolutely. India had a long and sophisticated history of learning with systems of education centered around Sanskrit and other classical languages.
Right.
But the British dismissed these traditions as outdated and inferior to Western knowledge.
It sounds like they were really trying to erase or at least diminish the value of existing Indian knowledge systems. Did they see any value in traditional Indian education?
There were some dissenting voices within the British administration who recognized the value of traditional Indian learning.
Okay.
And they argued for a more inclusive approach, one that blended Western and Indian knowledge systems.
So there was some internal debate within the British ranks about the best approach to education in India.
There was, but ultimately the push for Western education prevailed, and this shift had a profound impact on Indian society, creating a new class of English-educated Indians who would play a crucial role in shaping the future of the country.
It's so fascinating how this seemingly well-intentioned effort to introduce Western education had such complex and far-reaching consequences. Were there other areas where this drive to modernize India based on British ideals came into play?
Another key area was social reform.
Okay.
The British saw certain Indian practices like satting the ritual burning of widows as barbaric and incompatible with their vision of a civilized society.
Yeah.
And so they sought to abolish such practices, often with little regard for the complexities of Indian social customs and beliefs.
It sounds like a classic example of cultural imperialism imposing their own values and judgments onto another culture. Did they make any attempts to understand the cultural context of these practices?
There were certainly individuals who tried to engage with Indian culture on its own terms and to understand the rationale behind certain practices.
Okay.
However, the dominant attitude was one of moral superiority, a belief that the British were obligated to eradicate practices they deemed backward or immoral.
So even though they initially tried to legitimize their rule through
Oh.
Indian texts and traditions,
Mm.
ultimately they ended up imposing their own vision of what India should be.
Yeah, you could say that while their initial fascination with the Vedas and the idea of an ancient constitution played a role in shaping their early policies, ultimately their approach to colonial rule was driven by a complex mix of pragmatism, ambition, and a belief in their own cultural superiority.
It's a fascinating and somewhat unsettling story, seeing how these ancient texts, full of profound wisdom and spiritual insights, were ultimately caught up in the machinery of colonialism.
It really highlights the complex and often contradictory nature of cultural encounters.
Yes.
What starts as fascination can easily morph into appropriation and even domination.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it reminds us today of the importance of engaging with other cultures with humility and respect, recognizing the value of diverse perspectives and ways of life.
Absolutely.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From the poetic beauty and profound philosophical insights of the Vedas to their complex and often contentious relationship with British colonialism.
It's been a journey through time and across continents, exploring the enduring power of ideas and the complex ways in which they shape our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought to ponder. How can we, in the 21st century, engage with ancient texts like the Vedas in a way that is both respectful and insightful?
How can we learn from the past without repeating its mistakes?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Vedas. Until next time, keep exploring.